This is Sparta, and King Leonidas here. Anyways, let's get down to the Spartan interview, guys. Just gotta see my notes here, which is a bit tricky with his helmet on. But yeah, so let me give you a bit of the history leading up to the Battle of 300, the Thermopylae battle, which was in 490 BC, 10 years before. The Persians were defeated by Greeks at the Battle of Marathon, which is a very famous battle in Greek history. So yeah, that's where the Persians would try and invade Greece constantly, because there was this ancient rivalry between them, and it went on for hundreds of years. They just didn't want to feel like they were defeated by them, so they kept on trying to invade again. So in 480 BC, 250,000 Persians invaded Greece. Now these guys were led by King Xerxes, right? It was Xerxes II, so this is all before Alexander's day and the Romans and all that. This is all Darius, I think it was the first, was about, and then he had Xerxes and then Darius again. So they basically went through cycles, renaming their kings of previous ones, despite all the failures. And then the film, he was played by Rodrigo Santoro, looked completely different to the real Xerxes, because he would have had beard and long hair and all this stuff, and in the film he's bald and he's got no hair. So anyways, so when they invaded, it was basically 7,000 Greeks and 300 Spartans that stood up to this challenge. So the Spartans marched from south, going up north, and then other Greeks came from all over Greece at the time. Because Greece wasn't really unified at that time. It was sort of more Sparta, and then northern Greece and all this stuff. This is all before Macedonia and King Philip and Alexander's days. But they were led by King Leonidas. So Leonidas had the say because he was the king of the south. He was played by Jared Butler very well in the film. Really bulked up, you know. Sorry, not like me, because there's no gym, so what am I going to do? So what happened was there was 2 days of hard fighting in the narrow pass known as the Hot Gates. So the Hot Gates of Thermopylae, it was this mountain pass, and that's how the 300, they used a spear formation, and against the Persians, they absolutely did nothing. They just lost their numbers of Persians, and they would get their asses kicked, and they weren't trained as well. The Spartans had a very difficult life and upbringing. As children, they were abused, raped, you know, basically like treated like dirt, you know, to gain them power and strength. They had to go barefoot, all this stuff. They had to live off blood soup. I mean, it was a horrible, horrible time. They would have to steal, and were punished. They would steal, but you can see that in other Spartan videos. Not mine, but a bit of the history. So on the third day, this is where it really like became crucial. Leonidas sent away all the Greeks, right? So he left it to his Spartans, so the Greeks wouldn't get any of the blame, because they had to go back and get replenishments. They had to restock and then bring reinforcements. And at that point, Leonidas knew that he was done. He knew that they were going to die, and he sacrificed himself anyway. Now these 300, they're very brave, because they knew they were going into their death. So what they did is they ventured out from the pass, leaving them vulnerable out in the open, and little did they know they're betrayed by Ephialtes, who is a local shepherd, you know, and he had a vendetta against the Spartans because he was deformed. He couldn't really become a Spartan warrior, so that was you know, something that nagged him. And then he used the chance to basically leak the information to the Persians, and then made him one of the biggest traitors of the history, not just Greece, but of all time. So they sacrificed the delay of invasion. That's really the tactics that they knew that they weren't going to win, that they couldn't beat, but Xerxes gave them one last chance to surrender, and they'd rather die on their legs than, you know, become, you know, slaves on their knees, right, as it was. And I don't blame them, you know. I mean, the Persians were like pretty brutal. So they were betrayed, and they're surrounded by Persian archers. Because it was a mountain pass, the archers just got everywhere through this back channel, or basically like this mountain sort of like route or whatever, this sneaky shortcut that Ephialtes showed them. They're all killed by these arrows. It was the biggest wave of arrows probably in the history of soldiers and wars at that time, and they completely annihilated him. They got Leonidas, and they decapitated him, put his head on a spike for all future rebellions, and, you know, to warn anybody else about any sort of going against the Persian Empire, which is a no-no. Alright, so no resistance or rebellion. That was all just like nipped in the bud. Until a few weeks later, there was the Battle of Salamis. Now that was led by an Athenian general known as Themistocles, and he was pretty much the ruler of the fleet, the Athenian fleet, and this was off the coast of Athens. So as the Persians basically went down the south and kicked some butt, then they would try and go north, and Athens was, you know, the capital, or the main city to invade back then. You know, that's what they were really going for. But they didn't realize that Themistocles had a superior fleet, and he was definitely way ahead of the Persians. The Persian triremes apparently weren't that well suited for high waves and bad weather, whereas the Greeks were kind of used to it because it was more their landscape and terrain. So that's how he defeated them, and with fire as well. And they show it in the film. If you see the second one, Rise of Empire, but I'll get to that at the end. So then this is again part of the real history that happened. As much as the Persians want to deny it, this all took place as in the history books. A year later, 479 BC, there was a massive battle of PLATAEA, and that's where the Greeks proved to the Persians it wasn't just the 300, it wasn't just the fleet, that all Greeks were standing together now and repelling this force because they've had enough. They didn't want to have any tyranny, they didn't want to be possessed, and Persians and Greeks, as I said, they always had this ancient beef. Okay? So the Greeks won again, and then the Persians finally retreated. So Xerxes at that point gave up, you know, tail between his legs, and then went back to Persia, which was Asia Minor pretty much, and they owned that whole region. And anyway, so the legend of the 300 grew over the ages and uses the battle cry. So in PLATAEA would have been used as the battle cry, possibly Salamis as well, even though the navy and the infantry are slightly different, but the legend would have grown at that point, and hence why we have the films and all the books and stuff today. So, what they would often chant is remember Thermopylae, or shout Thermopylae, the brave 300, you know? I mean, again, why would they be doing this if none of this ever happened, right? But let's, this is where the proof comes in, okay? So let's go into the many Greek and Western writers learn of this lesson, all right? It's a critical moral and cultural lesson that we all learn. So in warfare, how there's winners and losers, it's more about the braveness and the sacrifice, and that's what really respect. You know, people respect nowadays, even modern soldiers, they look back at these ancient warriors and tactics and all that stuff, and they heavily respect the bravery, and, you know, I mean, just the times that we lived in have been very, very harsh. So, Greek writers included Herodotus and Simonides. Don't know much about him, but everyone knows Herodotus, you know, he was a philosopher and all that, and historian. And they were fascinated by the history, the skill, and the sacrifice of the 300. So Greeks in general, by that time Greeks were prior Romans, so they were the center of the world, center of culture, center of education, center of knowledge, and then eventually went into the West. So the Western writers included Lord Byron and A.E. Housman. Don't know much about Housman, but Byron everybody knows. Now there is one book that's not also worth a mention, which is Stephen Pressfield's novel, The Gates of Fire. Now that's referring to the hot gates, obviously the Thermopylae, you know, it's a mountain pass, as you will, the route. And then there's 3 Hollywood films. Now a lot of people don't know about the very first one, which was the 300 Spartans in 1962. So that was the original, that's what inspired Frank Miller to do the comic, and so on and so on. So there you have Richard Egan as King Leonidas, who was famous at the time. David FARRAR, also very famous at the time, played Xerxes, because obviously they didn't have, you know, darker skinned people back then, so it was all played by white guys. And then most famously Ralph Richardson as Themistocles. So Richardson is obviously the Richardson Empire, you know, we all know them in Natasha and all them nowadays. That's all descendants from Ralph Richardson, so he played Themistocles. So there'd been a little bit about that Navy battle in it. I haven't seen it, I've been trying to track it down, but God willing, I'll find it. Okay, so either way, that film is what really inspired Frank Miller to do the comic book, so the graphic novel that we all know. And that's what inspired SNYDER to direct it, and then history, as we know, was made. Okay, the sword and sandal epic was back, and briefly, from Gladiator till about Alexander, it was quite popular and successful, and 300, like anything, made it even more so. Alright, but hold that thought. So Frank Miller was having a good old time around that period, because he would come off the success of Sin City, where he co-directed with Robert Rodriguez, and then straight on to 300, which was, you know, a big passion project of his, and visually is fantastic. It's one of the best comics ever. It's one of the few I've actually read. So once that inspired Zach to make that film, that success led on to the sequel, Rise of an Empire, which wasn't as good, you know. It was more about Themistocles and the fleet, which is good, but they changed the timeline a bit, the real history. So in actual fact, the battle was weeks later. In the film, to make it a bit more sort of tense and suspenseful, they made it very close and interlinked, so it literally happened the following day or at the same time. I think they were going at the same time. So, Rise of an Empire, that was called. Sullivan Stapleton, the lead actor, he was kind of launched for that, Australian guy. You can see him in Blind Spot, but he's done a few things since then, so obviously helped out his career. Eva Green was in it, she was a great bad guy. Rodrigo Santoro came back as Xerxes, a different take on it, but again, not the same as the first one. Zack Snyder really touched gold there. So then we had the flops, Troy and Alexander, So Troy was Wolfgang Petersen's kind of epic and all that, and with Brad Pitt, all these stars, they thought it couldn't fail. The fight scenes were good, the big wide shot CG shots were good, but the film not so much. And then sadly Oliver Stone's epic Alexander. And you can watch Descendant and my Alexander interview to learn a little bit more, but he was Oliver Stone's, like, his dream project, you know. Spielberg had Lincoln, Scorsese had Gangs in New York, this was Oliver Stone's, and sadly it didn't go that way. Colin Farrell, yeah, it was okay, the accents were a bit all over the place, a bit too long, a bit too faffy, but the battle scene's excellent. Now, again, Gladiator 2000, that's what really launched this whole sword and sandal epic sort of genre, or brought it back even, because it was big in the 50s, these classic big epics. But then, sadly, Troy Alexander really killed it, nipped it in the bud. 302 didn't help, so that was it, and that's all I gotta say about Sparta. Alright? King Leonidas. King Leonidas.